In July of 1968, a researcher named Dr. John B. Calhoun initiated an experiment that would challenge the very foundations of sociology. He constructed a paradise for rodents, a 101-inch square enclosure known simply as Universe 25. Every biological constraint was eradicated. There were no predators, no disease outbreaks, and an absolute abundance of food, water, and nesting material. It was a literal utopia, designed to support up to 3,800 mice without physical scarcity. Calhoun introduced 4 pairs of healthy mice. What followed was a pristine mathematical curve of success. In Phase A, they established social structures. In Phase B, the population exploded, doubling every 55 days as they capitalized on this endless resource pool. But then, the curve flattened. Long before the enclosure reached physical capacity, at just 2,200 mice, the society broke. The social machinery collapsed. Mice stopped courting, mothers abandoned their young, and a generation grew up entirely stripped of behavioral instincts. Calhoun called this phenomenon the behavioral sink.
The common source of these disturbances became most dramatically apparent in the 3 populations of our first series of 3 experiments, in which we observed the development of what we call a behavioral sink.
What happens to a species when physical survival requires zero effort, but the social structures meant to guide them are systemically broken? Today, we look at the modern Western world, not through the lens of political hyperbole, but through the objective mechanics of Calhoun's experiment. Are we living out the late-stage phases of Universe 25? To understand how a civilization enters a behavioral sink, we must first look at its golden age. For the Western world, it was the post-World War II era. Between 1945 and 1970, the West experienced an unprecedented explosion in quality of life. The implementation of clean water infrastructure, penicillin, automated agriculture, and reliable electricity grids meant that for the first time in human history, the baseline threat of immediate starvation and disease was functionally minimized. This abundance triggered the baby boom. Families were large, social trust was exceptionally high, and civic institutions, churches, local leagues, neighborhood assemblies formed a robust bedrock. Life had clear, tangible structure. A single working-class income could purchase a home, support a spouse, and secure the future for multiple children. To truly understand the depth of our current behavioral sink, we must first look at the primal, evolutionary software that allowed human civilization to survive in the first place. For thousands of years, human societies were governed by the harsh realities of physical survival, and at the absolute core of that survival was an implicit understanding of biological value. In a strict species preservation sense, life was structured around reproduction and protection. Children were viewed as sacred. They were the literal survival insurance of the tribe, the future labor force, and the continuation of the lineage. Because of this, women occupied a position of profound, protected importance. Biologically, women are the bottleneck of human reproduction. Because of this asymmetric reality, human society treated men as biologically expendable. A man's evolutionary purpose was not to be coddled. It was to be used as a shield. Men were tasked with the high-risk, high-mortality duties of civilization, fighting off predators, defending territory from rival tribes, and performing the grueling, dangerous physical labor required to extract resources from a hostile environment. The social contract was simple, brutal, and highly effective. Men provided the protection and resources, absorbing the physical mortality of the world, so that women and children could remain safe within the enclosure to propagate the species. This was not a system born of arbitrary malice. It was the foundational architecture of human survival. But biological frameworks require a spiritual blueprint to sustain them, and for the Western world, that cornerstone was Christianity. The unprecedented success of Western civilization was built directly upon a Christian moral framework. It established the bedrock of our legal codes, the sacred inviolability of the nuclear family structure, and a deep, binding cultural conscience. Christianity provided Western man with a profound sense of transcendent purpose, the dedication to something infinitely bigger than the self. It taught that every individual was made in the image of God, creating the psychological framework for true human rights and equality under the law, while demanding absolute moral accountability. It was this spiritual anchor that disciplined the raw animal instincts of the population, holding the behavioral sink at bay by turning individual survival into a collective holy duty. But just like Universe 25 at day 315, an invisible ceiling was approaching. In August of 1971, the economic architecture of the West was quietly shifted.
To defend the dollar against the speculators, I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
By severing the monetary system from tangible limits and embracing unbacked fiat currency, the West modified its economic enclosure. The focus shifted from tangible production to systemic financial speculation. Abundance remained on the surface, but the underlying spiritual, social, and financial baseline was destabilized. In Universe 25, food and water were delivered automatically through metal hoppers. The mice didn't have to navigate a complex marketplace or trade value to survive. In the human enclosure, our medium of exchange is currency. When you debase the currency, you distort reality itself. Over the past 50 years, Western central banking systems have engaged in a relentless expansion of debt and money printing. This currency debasement acts as an artificial crowding mechanism. It doesn't reduce the physical space of a nation, but it radically shrinks the financial breeding grounds. When the cost of real estate is artificially inflated by cheap credit and money printing, a young family's territory is stolen. The government does not spend tax dollars. Instead, it borrows that money. And for every dollar it borrows, it has to pay it back with interest. This effectively trades the labor of the next generations for wealth today. It is a scam, a Ponzi scheme. It is the indentured servitude of the youth of tomorrow to line the pockets of society today. And now, the bill has come due. The cost of living crisis was not a mistake. It was by design. When a young man must work 80 hours a week simply to afford a sterile apartment, marriage is delayed, and the biological impulse to reproduce is suppressed. Simultaneously, the expansion of expansive welfare policies altered the social incentives. Historically, the human family was not just an emotional construct, it was an economic safety net. Parents raised children, and children cared for aging parents. Communities relied on mutual aid. By inserting a centralized state bureaucracy as the ultimate provider of healthcare, housing, and pension security, the foundational incentive to build and preserve a cohesive nuclear family was dismantled. The state became the proxy patriarch. When survival is detached from social cohesion, individuals naturally drift toward isolated cells. Why brave the social friction of marriage and compromise when the digital state hopper feeds you regardless? And as the family unit decays, the state apparatus swells into an omnivorous leviathan. Today, Western governments waste staggering, unimaginable sums of taxpayer wealth on an entrenched, self-serving bureaucracy. Hundreds of billions are funneled into unmitigated forever wars abroad and international slush funds like USAID, which federal investigations have caught presiding over massive multi-million-dollar bribery, fraud, and pay-to-play contract schemes. Domestically, the hopper is completely broken. Vital social services are routinely pillaged by criminal syndicates. In Australia, the heavily bloated National Disability Insurance Scheme, or NDIS, has been plagued by rampant rorting, fake billing, and widespread provider scams. In the United States, corporate childcare centers and state subsidy frameworks are systematically defrauded. Yet, when these systemic vulnerabilities are brought to light, officials within government chambers routinely choose to look the other way. Trapped in a prison of political correctness, leaders ignore these bleeding wounds out of a paralyzing, pathological fear of being labeled a racist, a bigot, or a phobe by the dominant ideological apparatus. The protective mechanisms of the state have been entirely neutralized by its own linguistic taboos. As these internal economic and social stressors caused native-born fertility rates to collapse far below the replacement baseline, Western elite structures implemented a dual-purpose strategy: high-volume, mass, international immigration. Instead of correcting the underlying currency debasement and social fractures that kept native populations from breeding, they chose to mass import a replacement population. This serves two distinct goals. Economically, it patches the collapsing tax base required to keep the state's top-heavy welfare liabilities from imploding. Politically, it allows the ruling bureaucratic class to establish a permanent, dependent voting base. By importing millions of individuals reliant on state infrastructure, the ruling party manufactures a reliable electorate, insulating itself from the political accountability of its native citizenry. But this artificial demographic intervention came with catastrophic long-term consequences. While mass migration temporarily patches structural labor shortages, importing millions of individuals from vastly different cultural, religious, and philosophical frameworks, without any meaningful enforcement of assimilation, shattered the host nation's shared values. Sociological research into multi-ethnic density highlights a sobering reality. When a society's cultural commonalities and common heritage are rapidly diluted, social trust plummets. This loss of trust is not merely between disparate groups. It causes communities to pull completely inward. Neighbors stop trusting neighbors. Civic engagement disintegrates. And the overarching cultural identity of the nation is completely atomized. The demographic fix didn't expand the human enclosure. It permanently fractured its social cohesion, introducing a rapid human equivalent of Phase C's social withdrawal. When physical challenges are eliminated from a population, ideological pathogens fill the vacuum. To understand why Western culture is fracturing, we have to look at the philosophy of cultural Marxism and the weaponization of group identity politics. In the early decades of the 20th century, traditional class-based Marxism failed to take hold in the West because the working class was becoming prosperous. Ideologues pivoted. If they couldn't fracture society along economic lines, they would fracture it along cultural lines. They replaced the bourgeoisie versus proletariat dynamic with oppressor versus oppressed, based on innate characteristics, race, biological sex, and sexual orientation. For a long time, this philosophy was confined to university departments. Around the year 2000, Western society was arguably at its most unified. The dominant cultural ethos was colorblindness and individual merit, judging people, as Martin Luther King Jr. championed.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
But around 2011, a profound shift occurred. The Occupy Wall Street movement had united the public against the financial elite, the 99% against the 1%. This posed a serious threat to institutional power. Almost overnight, the cultural conversation was intentionally fractured. Data scientists analyzing media databases have tracked a staggering 400% explosion in terms like racist, white supremacy, and privilege in major news outlets beginning immediately after 2011. This corporate media push coincided perfectly with the birth of modern social media algorithms. Platforms discovered that content-driving outrage, tribalism, and moral grievance generated the highest user retention and ad revenue. A hyper-profitable ecosystem emerged. Creators, media networks, and activists realized that capitalizing on racial friction, highlighting police brutality out of context, and leaning into Western guilt was a guaranteed path to virality. Western guilt became a multi-billion-dollar commodity. By convincing a civilization that its history, ancestors, and very foundations are uniquely evil, you strip them of their protective cultural immune system. This triggers a human psychological equivalent to Calhoun's behavioral sink. Individuals lose pride in their lineage, social trust erodes, and a unified collective identity shatters. This systematic fracturing has fueled a toxic resurgence of traditional Marxism, cloaked in the modern language of wealth resentment. When structural conditions tighten, the populace is conditioned to blame the rich and frame wealth inequality as the root of all human suffering. This is a profound, calculated lie. Wealth inequality is not the cause of societal decay. It is the natural, mathematical byproduct of varied competence, effort, and liberty in a free society.
Pareto distributions govern, for example, the distribution of money, which is why 1% of the people in the general population have the overwhelming amount of money, and 1/10 of that 1% has almost all of that. If you look at the number of people who are producing in a given domain, the square root of the people produce half the product. So that means if you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work, but if you have 10,000 employees, 100 of them do half the work. But to blame that on the oppressive nature of a given system is to radically underestimate the complexity of the problem. Anyways, the reason I'm telling you about that is because after the peasants were granted their land and started to become farmers, a tiny minority of them became extremely successful, and those people produced almost all of the food for Russia and the Ukraine. So what happened in the 1920s when bloody Lenin came along and collectivized the farms was that they defined the kulaks, who were these tiny minority of successful farmers who maybe had a brick house and were able to hire a couple of people and had some land and some livestock and were very productive people. They defined them as socially unfriendly elements, and they sent groups of intellectuals out into the towns to collectivize the farms. And so the idea was that, well, you would pool your land and everyone would farm it collectively, and the land was taken away, of course, from the tiny minority of people who were actually productive and had actually managed to own much of the land. So you have to imagine how that would occur. Okay, so it's in the 1920s, it's after World War I, Russia's in pretty bad shape, the villages are full of brutalized men who have post-traumatic stress disorder and lots of people who are not doing well at all, and the bloody intellectuals come into the town and they say, you know those successful farmers up the street that you've always been pretty jealous about in your useless manner? Well, they're actually pigs and demons who are stealing from you, so why don't you come out, we'll form a nice little mob and we'll take everything they've got. And that's exactly what happened, and all those people were killed or raped or set off to Siberia in the middle of the bloody winter where there wasn't even anything for them anywhere for them to live or anything for them to eat, so they all died. And then the consequence of that was a few years later, 6 million people starved to death in the Ukraine.
By hyper-focusing on wealth envy, the ideological apparatus successfully turns citizens against each other. It convinces the disgruntled to burn down the factories, the businesses, and the legal infrastructures that actually generated the abundance they enjoy. It is a pathological cycle where a population is manipulated into biting the hand that feeds them, replacing productive ambition with venomous, parasitic resentment. This algorithmic monetization of friction didn't just divide us by demographic. It corrupted our baseline psychology, accelerating an epidemic of hyper-narcissism. When a population faces no threat of starvation, its focus turns entirely inward. We see this in the viral cultural phenomenon of looks-maxing, where millions of young men and women spend hours obsessively measuring facial angles, tracking jawline definitions, and treating their physical bodies as high-status digital commodities to be optimized for internet applause. It is the absolute fixation on the self. And when real existential problems vanish, a prosperous society will pathologically manufacture artificial ones to fill the void. Humans are evolutionarily wired to struggle. For thousands of years, our ancestors woke up to a reality of profound hardship. They fought against the elements, against starvation, against absolute infant mortality. Struggle gave them an unshakable point of orientation. But the modern West has become a tragic victim of its own immense success. We have created a world so physically safe, so effortlessly automated, that we have starved the human spirit of its necessary adversity. In this vacuum of real hardship, we witness the rise of pathological empathy, a weaponized compassion that prioritizes surface-level emotional validation over objective truth. We watched this peak during the destructive civil unrest of the 2020 BLM riots. Decades of built-up, unchanneled youth energy erupted under the guise of moral righteousness. Cities burned, local businesses were devastated, and communities were fractured, not out of a practical pursuit of justice, but as a performative, cathartic release for a generation suffering from a profound lack of real purpose. People were quite literally burning down their own enclosure just to feel the heat of a struggle they never had to endure historically. As Calhoun's Universe 25 entered Phase C, the most terrifying breakdown occurred between the sexes. Courtship rituals vanished. The males became pathologically passive or hyper-aggressive, failing to protect territory. The females became defensive, aggressive, and entirely unsympathetic to suitors, eventually driving them away and abandoning the reproductive cycle altogether. Today, the West is experiencing an ideological and biological division of the sexes without historical precedent. Radicalized iterations of modern feminism have shifted from advocating for equal rights to framing the traditional family unit and masculinity as inherently oppressive. In reaction to this cultural hostility, and combined with economic displacement, a massive counterculture of young men has retreated into the digital shadows.
I have not interacted with a female that is not related to me in over 3 years.
This is incel culture, the involuntary celibates, and the wider black pill philosophy, which posits that romantic success is entirely genetically predetermined and futile. The natural bridge of courtship between young men and women has been burned, replaced by digital dating apps designed like slot machines to maximize alienation. When we look deeply into this chasm, we find an existential tragedy. Men are fundamentally failing women, and women are fundamentally failing children. Men have abandoned their prime biological mandate to be protectors and providers. Stripped of structural expectations, they have retreated into a passive, risk-averse lethargy, failing to offer women the strength, security, and reliable commitment required to build a sanctuary for new life. They have left women isolated, bearing the weight of a chaotic cultural landscape alone. And in turn, women are failing children. Influenced by a culture that devalues maternal sacrifice and frames motherhood as an obstacle to self-fulfillment, the sacred focus on child-rearing has collapsed. Children are increasingly viewed as lifestyle accoutrements rather than the continuous purpose of the species. Mothers are handing their offspring over to sterile, institutional state daycares at infancy, abandoning the deep, foundational emotional nurturing that only a mother can provide. The intergenerational transmission of love, boundaries, and identity is completely severed at the root. When Calhoun's Universe 25 entered its late stages, the breakdown of natural maternal and paternal roles didn't just stop reproduction. It fundamentally broke the psychological development of the offspring that did manage to survive. In the modern West, we are watching this exact phenomenon play out through the systematic dissolution of the nuclear family. The introduction of no-fault divorce laws and the cultural normalization of the broken home have created a demographic catastrophe. Millions of Western children are now raised in fatherless environments. Decades of sociological data across the United States, the UK, and Australia have laid bare the devastating tax of this structural collapse. Children raised without a father are statistically overrepresented in almost every metric of societal failure. They face a manifold increase in youth suicide rates, suffer dramatically higher levels of clinical depression and anxiety, and comprise the vast majority of juveniles entering the criminal justice system. For boys, the absence of a masculine archetype leaves them without a blueprint for channeling aggregate aggression, leading to a massive spike in violent behavioral disorders.
A 16-year-old boy was shot and killed while waiting for his school bus. Shot by other teenagers, shot it seems for absolutely no reason.
For girls, the lack of paternal validation often manifests in early pregnancy and a cycle of unstable relationships. This is a profound identity crisis born from a severed lineage. A generation of children forced to navigate a complex world without a stable foundation. And as the biological priorities of the species have been inverted, the legal framework has followed. In a natural survival state, the optimization of the child's safety is paramount. Today, that hierarchy has been flipped. The institutionalization of unrestricted, on-demand abortion has shifted the moral landscape. The child is no longer viewed as a sacred continuation of the species, but frequently as an economic inconvenience that can be terminated for any reason. The autonomy of the individual has been placed entirely above the survival of the offspring. But the inversion does not stop there. In a bizarre, late-stage twist that mirrors the absolute confusion of Calhoun's crowded mice, the cultural elite has begun dismantling the very definitions of the sexes they claim to protect. We have watched a social movement that initially claimed to champion women's liberation pivot into an ideology that actively erodes the spaces women fought to establish. Through the implementation of gender identity politics, biological men who transition into trans women are now frequently placed above biological women in institutional hierarchies. They are permitted into female domestic violence shelters, rape crisis centers, prisons, locker rooms, and athletic competitions, completely disrupting the physical and psychological safety boundaries that women historically maintained. When a civilization can no longer define what a woman is, when it actively subsidizes the breakdown of the fatherless home, and when it treats its own children as disposable, it has entered the final, chaotic feedback loop of the behavioral sink. The basic categories of human reality have been completely scrambled. This complete scrambled reality has manifested a cultural landscape filled with forever children, an entire demographic of adults who simply refuse to grow up. John B. Calhoun observed that the final generations of Universe 25 were physically mature, but psychologically infantile.
It's inhibited because the last few hundred maintained them as juveniles, and although they're now adults, they no longer engage in aggressive behavior or in reproductive behavior. And we call them the beautiful ones because they're so excellent physically, they're unstressed. I see one down here. Most of these live in the apartment houses and rarely come out, but I see one who's taken temporary refuge in one of the nesting material supply cans.
They never transitioned into the burdens of adulthood. Across the West, the traditional milestones of maturity, marriage, mortgage, sacrifice, and parenthood are being actively avoided. We are living out an epidemic of Peter Pan syndrome. Men aren't men anymore because society no longer demands the heavy armor of protection and provision, and the regression is mirrored on the other side of the aisle. We are watching a surreal phenomenon where adult women buy viral gremlin-faced vinyl toys like the hyper-trendy Labubu dolls, dressing them up in tailored outfits, displaying them in clear pouches, and unironically treating these plastic collectibles with the protective care, financial investment, and emotional attention historically reserved for actual children. When a civilization trades the sacred, messy, and exhausting reality of raising human offspring for the sterile convenience of a plush toy, it has reached peak psychological decay. It is the ultimate manifestation of a society that has voluntarily chosen its own sterilization. Look at Calhoun's description of the beautiful ones. These were mice that faced no hardships, so they completely withdrew from the messy, competitive social landscape. They didn't fight for territory, and they didn't pursue females. They spent their entire lives eating, sleeping, and obsessively grooming their fur. They were physically flawless, but socially sterile. We are watching the rise of the human beautiful ones. Young adults who opt out of real-world relationships entirely to focus on hyper-individualistic self-optimization, personal aesthetics, and career progression. They live in pristine, curated apartments, replacing children with pets and physical intimacy with algorithms, online porn, or virtual AI companions. They have chosen a comfortable, sterile isolation. They are experiencing the first death, the death of the spirit, long before the physical line stops moving. The narrative of Universe 25 is bleak because mice are prisoners of their biology. When their social software fractured, they lacked the capacity to step outside the enclosure, analyze their behavior, and consciously rewrite their destiny. But humanity is different. We are not rodents in a cage. We have history, philosophy, foresight, and free will. The behavioral sink is not an inevitability. It is a choice. If we understand the variables causing our decline, we can deliberately choose to build an escape hatch.